Theo Sibiya, the Managing Director of A.T Kearney, says in Dubai there's a huge demand for expertise and insights to help both the public and private sector explore new avenues for growth. And there has been a significant growth in ties between the Gulf region and Africa. CNBC Africa's Chris Bishop caught up with him from Dubai to discuss this and more.
What we're witnessing in terms of this particular market from a consulting perspective is that there's a huge demand for people with the expertise and insights to help businesses explore new avenues for growth, whether it be in their current markets, but also in other markets such as Africa or even Europe in some respects. So I think overall with the direction that the Gulf region has taken, it's created space for ideas to blossom and for us to help organizations, whether it be public or private sector, explore new ways of doing things. And that has led to a lot of consulting opportunities and partnerships with clients.
What is the growing relationship between Dubai and Africa? How has that increased in the years you've been operating on this route?
Yeah, it's been an interesting development because I think in the last couple of years we've seen a significant growth in ties between the regions. I think there's a recognition that both the Gulf region and the African continent share a lot of similarity. They're both emerging markets. They both have infrastructure backlogs. Of course, the Middle East has been quicker in closing those backlogs. But in terms of the opportunities, they're very, very, very similar. So we've seen, and in our own business, we've restructured our regions such that we've grouped the Middle East and Africa together because we see a lot of synergies. And so it's a natural progression in our view to drive growth from that.
And overall in the continent, there's that saying that's in vogue at the moment: if you're not in Africa, you're not in business. At the moment, what are you seeing from the continent that's giving you that hope for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I often put the question differently. Say, if you're not in Africa, why on earth would you not be in Africa? Why are you not investing in Africa? Because there's just so much in terms of what Africa has to offer at this particular point in time. And here I'm not just being an Afro-optimist, but I'll state the facts. If you look in terms of economic growth, 6 out of 10 fastest growing economies are actually in Africa. If we look at peace and stability, Africa has gone through all the wars and civil wars and coups and all sorts. We've got a sustained period of peace, which in of itself drives a little bit more security if you want to make investments. You've got a huge young population. We often talk about it as the youth dividend, where we expect to have over 420 million youth under the age of, I think it's under the age of 30, I think, which is massive, probably the fastest growing youth population in the world. What does that bring you? It brings you entrepreneurial capabilities. It brings you people able to leverage technology. It brings you a workforce that can actually work in the factories and so forth that we expect to see in Africa. And on top of that, you've got massive drive towards deregulation and allowing private sector to play a role in terms of stimulating economies. Probably the most we've seen in my lifetime at least, and probably beyond that. So, huge investment opportunities, huge pent-up demand, a young population, backlogs in terms of infrastructure that people can invest in. I just see massive opportunity on the continent.
What about West Africa in particular? Most people who will be watching this program avidly at the moment have got their interests there. What do you see as the bright spots in West Africa?
So West Africa's got a lot of opportunity in our view. We've seen a lot of West African intra-trade on the rise, and as a result of probably more of a regional perspective in terms of driving intra-trade. There's a common monetary regime, if I can call it that, which also enables trade and facilitation, but also very strong intent to deregulate and to drive the collaboration within the region. So it's a huge opportunity for anyone looking to invest in that particular region at this point in time, because now more than ever there's a willingness to crowd in as much capacity and capital into opportunities in West Africa.
Where do you think the smart money should be looking in West Africa at the moment? What sort of areas and industries do you think are the ones that are promising?
Well, there's a couple of industries that we in our research have identified as huge opportunities. First and foremost, I would put agriculture as one of the key areas that any investor looking at opportunities in the continent, and even more so in West Africa, as an area to look into. But it would have to be at a certain point within the value chain, and we can talk about that in a little bit more detail later. I think there's power opportunities that need to be explored. So there's a lot of projects on the go at the moment in respect of power and powering Africa, and bringing more power to the population. But they're still probably not going to meet the demand, and so there's still a huge opportunity to play a role in the power sector. And then manufacturing, and manufacturing is probably not just a West African challenge, but probably a broader African. But in West Africa, you have the same sort of opportunities. And here it's really around, moving the West African economies beyond the sort of primary export-oriented companies to more beneficiation of the resources that they have, which will be done through manufacturing capability, so that you can actually now start providing more sort of value-added goods as opposed to just exporting raw materials. And if that's done well, there's huge opportunity in the West African market.
And this African free trade area that everyone's talking about at the moment is going to completely change the game. The finance minister of South Africa, Tito Mboweni, called it the story of the century. How much is it going to change, you think?
Well, I'd say it is a big story. Whether it's the story of the century or not, I may have a slightly different view, but it is a game changer, right? It's a game changer both in terms of its intent, right, which is around trying to get more intra-trade happening on the continent. We're way behind other parts of the world. But then also, if we do get it right, and we do start to see a growth in intra-trade, it's fundamentally going to shift, I think, almost exponentially, the economies of many of the countries in Africa. Of course, it does face a lot of challenges, and we can't help but to actually take stock of that. But in my view, very, very significant opportunities as a result of the.
What challenges does it face, you think?
Well, there are a number of hurdles that we possibly need to overcome. So the intent is there, but we need to understand, in order to facilitate trade, you need to have the infrastructure, so your roads and rail infrastructure to facilitate the movement of goods becomes a sticking point. 2, your data and the way you manage data and you can exchange data between different countries needs to be addressed. 3, you've got customs regulations and corruption, even in many instances, that needs to be overcome. And then thirdly, you've got tariff regimes, which is one of the key focus areas. One of the key focus areas of the agreement is about reducing those tariffs and trying to create a level playing field. Easier said than done, right? Because there's a lot of people within that whole system that benefit from obviously higher tariffs and sort of customs regulations that in terms of them staying as they are. So these are significant challenges, by the way. So I'm not expecting that the free trade is going to yield benefits in the short term, but probably in the long term, if those kind of factors can be overcome effectively.
How likely is it that Africa is going to be able to set up like a sort of Brussels type setup in Europe, where you have this kind of administration for the whole continent? Where would it be? How practical is it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion around exactly that, and having some central body that can, disseminate the standards, the code of conduct, the business rules, etc., to try and facilitate this kind of environment. As things stand at the moment, a lot of the conversations are being driven through the African Union, through Ethiopia, where they're based at this moment in time. I don't think there's a final decision as to where it's best located. There are players that I think would be better suited to doing it, probably the smaller economies of the continent, who don't have overwhelming power, and can be honest players, as it were, or arbitrators in terms of facilitating those kind of conversations. So in my mind, countries like your Rwanda, for example, may be a good place to have that kind of, it's small like Brussels as well, so it would be a good place to have that kind of capacity and capability, because it doesn't really, its economy is not big enough to be seen to be favoring them in any sort of way, and they could be an honest broker in the kind of conversations that need to be had.
I know I'm looking far into the future here, but what about the settlement system if there was like a single market in Africa? Since I last spoke to you about it, I spoke to Lesetja Kganyago, the Reserve Bank governor, and he said that he felt that the West African, the East African, the SADC settlement systems that already exist in the custom could be actually linked up together, and it might be less of a problem settling bills from one end of the continent to the other than we may think. I don't know. What's your view on it?
Yeah, I can see merit in that line of thinking, but I think to some extent it doesn't take into consideration some of the the detailed on the ground issues. So many of these regional trading blocks, whether it's your ECOWAS or your SADC and so forth, there's a perception that a lot of those intra-trade hurdles have been overcome. It's not necessarily the case. You still have certain anomalies that still persist there, which would then be amplified if you try then to have intra-regional trade. So in as much as I can see merit in it, I think it would be a lot more complex than one can imagine. And ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of these agreements are between countries, not between regions. And you can be in a region fictionally or by virtue of where you are, but you need to have an agreement. Whether you're in Cote d'Ivoire and you want to trade with DRC, you need to have an agreement between the two countries. You might even need to have some level of bilateral agreement to facilitate that trade. Both of you being in different regions, and assuming that those hurdles are overcome by being different and by getting agreement between the two different regions, I think is not necessarily going to be the case.
And what can it do for investment in the day when it does come? I mean, people are saying maybe 10, 20 years before we see a final trading block put in place in Africa. But after that, surely it'll be a boon for investors because you'll be able to invest across borders, essentially.
Yeah, so definitely. What I would say, Chris, and maybe it's a slight diversion from your point, in that I've looked at Africa from a number of perspectives and looked at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, looked and tried to understand where the opportunities may be for external investors into the African continent. Now, in terms of our studies, what's clear is Africa is predominantly an exporter of primary resources, of stuff that's dug up the ground and is sent on ships and so forth, right? Apart from South Africa. South Africa, to some extent, has manufacturing capability, right? But even South Africa, with a strong manufacturing base, does not complete the whole value chain. So they even export sort of partially finished goods, right, and then buy them back, having been beneficiated elsewhere in the world. If one wants to look and say where the investment opportunities to bring effect to the African Free Trade Agreement would be to looking at investments further along the manufacturing, so to try and beneficiate the goods that we already are to some extent manufacturing, and that would be a huge, because then you can start trading. Because if you're still going to be exporting this stuff, you're still going to be trading, with countries off the continent. So build that manufacturing capability, right? That is going to drive into trade, right? So that we don't have to import, right?
Which is still quite low, which is something like 17%. Yeah,
it's still very low. But if you want to invest in there. Take advantage of the free market, of one common market. That's really where I see a massive opportunity. Agriculture as well, same thing. If you can get into the right sort of agricultural investments, then you can play across the whole continent, because everyone is aware that this is one of the key sort of assets or potential that the continent actually presents.
And that was Theo Sibiya. He's the Managing Director of A.T Kearney. And that's it on Beyond Markets for today, and thank you so much for joining me. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website. That's at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Igbomo. Have a wonderful day.